Okay, so here is the mini lecture for week 5. First, I'm going to give a quick review of what we've talked about so far in class, and then we're going to get into kind of the meat of the topic for this week. So, as a review, some of the things that we have already talked about is first, anthropogenic climate change, which is just wreaking havoc on our weather and our environmental systems, and it's only going to get worse. It's caused by humans pouring millions of tons of carbon dioxide into our atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution, and although the entire world is affected, some regions are more vulnerable to climate changes than are others, and in a very unfortunate irony, many of these regions tend to be those that are least responsible for causing climate change. As a review, we talked about cultural community psychology, which more than anything, think about how it focuses on the context of psychological well-being. So for an example, if a person is in an anxiety-provoking situation for a very long period of time, that person is probably going to be experiencing anxiety, yeah? However, if we treat the anxiety, we are missing the point entirely, that it is not the person that is the problem or the anxiety that's the problem, it's the situation that that person is in, and it's the situation that needs to be addressed. So this is cultural community psychology, it's looking at context, yeah? Also, we talked about the psychology of climate change in very broad terms, which in these sweeping terms, we're addressing the human understanding, emotions, motivations, behaviors, or inactions that regard climate change. So we have been and we will continue to be talking about all of these things. A lot of your term papers are on these specific issues with climate change. So when we talk about cultural community psychology and climate change, cultural community psychology, of course, focusing so much on culture and context and things like this, we're looking at how the diversity of human being, so who we are as people, and also the diversity of human experiences, so the context that we are in, how these different diversities impact the psychology of climate change. And so now we are going to, that we've covered all of these kind of broad issues, we're going to start getting into the real meat of the topic. So we're going to start looking for the next 8 weeks on factors that of diversity. And we're starting this week with race, ethnicity, culture, and minority status. We'll talk more specifically about these things and how they relate to climate change and to environmental issues next week. This week we're going to focus more on understanding how this aspect of diversity affects psychology and well-being in general, so that we can have a foundation when we begin to talk more specifically about how it affects climate change. We will touch on this. Some of your questions for the discussion forums do have to do with climate change, so think about it on your own. But what the readings are about and what this mini lecture is about is just understanding how this aspect of diversity affects us as people. So first, let's talk about terms. So we have race. Race is a BS term. It is a pseudo-scientific concept that was developed back in a time when we were trying to develop a hierarchy of humanness. So in those terms, in those days, we had 3 races. We had Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Negroid. These days, we tend to divide people more by skin color, so we have like Hispanics or brown people. We have Native Americans or red people. So we have all sorts of ways to divide people by skin tone, and we call it race, and this is all crap. This is all crap. It has nothing to do with our psychology or our physical or intellectual abilities. It doesn't even have to do with our features, really. If you compare pictures of males and females from different races, you'll notice that there is more difference from male to female than there is between races. So it's all crap. The question then is, if it's all crap, why are we talking about it? Well, race is a social construct, in large part due to this pseudo-scientific history of the term and the idea of race. The concept has been embraced by people, and it has been used. It has caused horrific, extraordinary historical differences in the ways people are treated, the opportunities that people have, the resources that are available to them, including inherited wealth, which is a huge factor in the current economic stratifications in our world and in our society. So what did your parents and grandparents have access to changes what you now have when you begin your life and as you move through your life. Race continues to be a very strong divider in our society, even though it's crap. It's crap, but it's powerful crap, so we do have to understand it, right? So as an example, I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, which is a majority black city. I'm saying black because we're talking about race, not ethnicity, which would be African American. We'll talk about that in a minute. So Memphis is about 60% black and 40% white. I lived in a black neighborhood growing up, and I got to see growing up from small kid time the differences between the lives of black people versus white people. So my neighbors were continuously experienced direct and systemic prejudices and oppressions that I was not exposed to, that I did not have direct experience with. We lived in the same neighborhood, we were next door to each other, 100 feet apart, and yet our lives were very different because of race. So we have to consider, we have to understand, race is powerful, even though it doesn't exist. Yeah? And this brings us to ethnicity. Ethnicity does exist. Ethnicity has to do with nationality, so of yourself and also of your forebears. I'm European American. I'm American born and raised. My parents too. But as we get back to further generations back, my people come from Ireland and from Slovenia, both in Europe. Yeah. And a lot of other places too, like most white people in the United States, I'm a mutt. But ethnicity is a blend of who you are now and who your people are or were. So this can get really sticky. I have a friend who is Chinese by birth. She was raised by Japanese parents, and she was adopted, and she was raised in Hawaii. So what is her ethnicity? There's not a clear answer, and there's often not a clear answer to define ourselves or to define people by their ethnicity, and yet it's done anyway. Another issue with ethnicity is that it's oftentimes conflated with culture, which I'll talk about culture in just a minute. In cultural studies and psychology and in other fields, very often it is too difficult or time-consuming to actually measure culture by how a person lives their life. So instead what they do is they have this list of different ethnicities, and you check the box according to your ethnicity, and then that is used as a proxy for culture. We make certain assumptions about who that person is based on which box they check. So we make assumptions about how they behave, what sorts of things they have experienced in their life, and these assumptions are not valid because we didn't measure those things. We only measured what box they check. An example here, consider a person who checks Asian American in Hawaii versus someone who checks Asian American in New York. So there are so many potential differences between these two people who check the same box. What country is their family from? How long ago did they immigrate? Did they immigrate as business owners or during plantation era or as refugees? Do they practice their culture at home? What languages do they speak? How similar are their daily lives between, Manhattan and Hilo? All of these things are just washed out. They're all hidden underneath that box checked Asian American, but there are assumptions that are made that these two people are similar in a lot of ways, and these assumptions just aren't valid. So when ethnicity is used as a proxy for culture, it's very frustrating because we're not actually getting the information that people assume we are getting. So we need to keep this in mind when we're looking at a lot of psychological studies, that they may not have measured culture. If they're talking about ethnicity, that's one thing, but if they're talking about culture, did they actually measure culture? Yeah. So this is very frustrating, and there is a movement in psychology to change how culture is measured and making sure that culture is measured when they say culture is being measured. But it's a slow process getting this change going, and it's ongoing. So hopefully in all of our careers we will be much smarter and do wonderful things. But this brings us to culture. Culture includes your daily life, your worldview, your values, your assumptions, your in-group similarities to the people who live in your region and or who are from your ethnicity. It's based on how you view your life or choose to go about your day, based on your norms and your expectations for how you think people ought to behave or what people ought to want. These ideas of what ought to be kind of get into your culture, your beliefs and your values and your assumptions. Culture is very complicated. It is messy, it is beautiful, and it is the single most important factor in terms of developmental impact. The culture you were raised in determines who you are more so than basically anything. It is very pervasive. It affects all of these other things that we have been and will be talking about. So what level of power people have in a society, depending on what is their gender and their ethnicity, their race, their SES. So how we treat people and how we allow others to treat each other has to do with culture as well. It's our expectations for reality, yeah? And this brings us to minority status. Minority status means that whatever race, ethnicity, or culture you belong to, where you are living right now, that another group has more power than your group. This other group, they control the norms, expectations, opportunities in political realms, economic realms, education realms, housing, jobs, voting, everything. Someone else has the power. Typically, that other group has more people. In the United States, for example, according to census last year, 72.4% of the population is white. Though we have made great strides in equality, white people continue to have more power in this country and more privilege in this country than do any other group. You can refer to your readings for this. But there are cases where it's not the majority population. So, for example, in apartheid South Africa, there was a minority white population who maintained an oppressive power. There's also the case in Rwanda, where the minority Tutsi population maintained control for centuries over the majority Hutu peoples. And in these cases, it was a smaller numerical group that was in power. But for the purposes of this class, we're going to define minority as the outgroup. So those who lack political, social, and or economic power. In the world, about 51% of people are women. But women often do not have a comparable level of power to men. And so women are considered a minority population, even though there are more of us. So when we're talking about minority status in this class, we're talking about groups that do not set the norms, that may have fewer opportunities because they are not members of the group that has the most power. That's what we mean when we're talking about minority status in this class. So this week, as you're going about your readings and the discussions and everything else, I want you to focus mostly on why are these constructs important, just generally in life. How do they affect us as people? How do they affect our human experiences? How do they affect our human psychology? Focus on these things. Also, in the back of your head, I want you to be considering, given these differences and given the importance of these constructs, how might the experiences with disasters or with climate change be different among these different groups? If people have more or less power in a society, if they have more or less access to opportunities or more or less access to resources, given their current status and the history of their peoples, how might this change the psychology of climate change? We will discuss this more in detail next week, but for now, just kind of be thinking about it and get your thoughts wet, I guess. But have at it, yeah. You have your assignments posted on La Lima and the readings. There's also the book Uprooting Racism from Kivel, and it's one of my favorite books ever, so I really hope you all enjoy it. And I have just certain sections from that book, although of course I would encourage you to read all of it. It is a really good book. But yeah, get to your assignments, and I will see you online. All right.